This is my beginner's guide to speedrunning Don't Starve Together. This guide will go over things such as the categories, where to submit your runs, recommended mods you should use, optimal settings, tips and tricks, and more. This video will serve as a basic introduction to DST speedrunning as a whole, and it will provide some general insight regarding various things you might be interested in learning more about, especially if you have no previous experience with speedrunning, and the things that you should be aware of before you attempt to do any runs. The information in this video should be relevant not just for anyone trying to do some speedruns of their own, but also for those who would simply like to watch more DST speedruns, follow the developments of the community, or just learn new things about the game. Before we begin to talk about strategies, mods, and everything else, we first have to talk about how exactly speedrunning in a game like DST works. Because as most of you may know, DST has no current way to beat it, and even though there are questlines that can be completed, worlds will just go on forever with no way to reach a credit screen or similar, unlike other games such as Minecraft or Terraria that have a more traditional main category where the goal is to simply defeat the final boss and reach the end credits as quickly as possible. Because of this, DST speedrunners don't try to beat the game, but they instead focus on accomplishing a single specific objective as fast as possible. The most popular categories usually involve killing some major boss to complete the run, but there are also categories for mini bosses such as tree guards, or even silly categories like the death speedrun. Currently, the largest archive of DST speedruns available can be found in the speedrun.com leaderboards, which are organized by categories such as whether the run was done in a set seed or on a random world, and whether it was done solo or in multiplayer. If you're not familiar with these terms, random seed or unseeded runs are what most people think of when they talk about DST speedrunning. Unseeded speedruns are performed on randomly generated worlds that the runner has no prior knowledge of. Because of this, luck and knowledge of world generation play an important factor, and runners usually have to rely on more consistent strategies over ones that may be too RNG dependent. Set seed or seeded speedruns involve using a mod to force a specific seed to generate, which essentially lets runners play on the same world over and over instead of a randomly generated one each time. Seeded speedruns are also very popular, especially for newcomers, since there is less pressure to perform well on a good seed, and instead the player can simply focus on developing a strategy that would be the fastest for that particular world. Seeded speedruns also give players more freedom to try out different strategies and compare them against each other, and even allows them to employ routes that would be considered too risky to be done in unseeded categories. If you're new to speedrunning DST, seeded speedruns are almost certainly the place to start, and it's even better now that the community has developed a way to automate the process of looking for the best seeds, but more on that later. Solo runs are obviously speedruns where only one player is present in the game. This is how most runners choose to play, mainly because it's a lot easier to retry a failed run if you're the only player in the game. But co-op speedruns are also on the leaderboards, and they can be quite fun if you have someone else to coordinate with. Additionally, many categories have bonus conditions, such as not cheesing the boss, or starting in a different season. You can read the details for each particular category in their respective rules section. Unless otherwise stated, categories in this site will only accept runs done on worlds with default settings. New categories will get added if players are interested in running them, so if you would like to see a particular category on the leaderboards, you're more than welcome to run it and see if other people are interested as well. Keep in mind that while DST is constantly being updated and speedrun strategies often come and go, runs that employ mechanics or strategies that have since been patched out are not removed from the leaderboards, so you don't have to worry about your runs getting deleted after an update comes out. That said, it's not uncommon for an update to significantly change how a certain category plays out, so in the majority of cases, we simply adapt to the new changes and try different strategies, instead of separating the old runs from the new ones. If you already have a run that you want to submit and you're not sure how, simply click this button to begin the submission process and fill out the details about the run. Select the categories that apply, input all the players that participated in the case of co-op runs, the in-game time of the run, or just an estimate since your time will be corrected by a moderator if necessary, a permanent link to a video of the run, your character choice or player count, the date that the run was performed, and the platform. Keep in mind that all runs are required to have video proof and they will not be accepted otherwise. If you don't have a speedrun.com account, the site will not let you access the submission form. Although if you don't wish to create an account, you can submit it directly to the moderators of the boards via the Discord server, and they will add it for you. After a run is submitted, you'll have to wait for a moderator to verify it, and if it meets all the rules, it should be visible on the leaderboards. That's pretty much the entire submission process. This might seem pretty obvious, but please read the rules before attempting to submit any runs. They can be found by clicking this button, and keep in mind that there are two different tabs, one for the game rules that apply to all categories, and another for the specific category you've selected. That said, most of them should already be pretty evident, things such as no console commands and no rollbacks during a run, and there really isn't much to worry about if you just want to submit a run that you performed casually. Most notably, you are not required to show world generation settings in your recording, so as long as you have everything from the character selection screen up until you complete your objective, and the footage is not altered in any major way, you should be good to go. If you're looking for community resources, the Speedrun.com website itself contains a few useful links that you'll want to check out before getting started. But the best place to access all the available resources will be the community's Discord server, which you can join via the leaderboards or via the link I'll be putting in the pinned comment and the description of this video. As soon as you join the Discord server, you'll get immediate access to useful links, such as the most important mods for speedrunning, the full list of approved mods, which we will talk about shortly, basic instructions to utilize world seeds, and links to all the leaderboards. If you scroll down, you'll find channels with the most up-to-date information and discussion about every category, including things such as potential changes to the rules, and you can even request new categories or suggest changes to the leaderboards or the server as a whole. In the server, you will also find the seeds channel, where players can share seeds that others might be interested in, and look for seeds that others have posted that may be good in a category they're running. As I mentioned earlier, members of our community have developed a way to look through seeds much faster and essentially automate the process. Thanks to this, you'll also be able to access lists containing thousands of world seeds that have already been filtered by which set pieces they contain, and even useful data such as the distance from the spawn portal to key locations. This has all happened very recently, but you might have already come across speedruns that utilize these new seeds, some of which are unbelievably lucky and would have never been found if not for these new resources. So if you're interested in doing seeded runs, now's a better time than ever to join, as most of the categories on the leaderboards have a lot of potential time to be saved, since their respective world records still use seeds that were found manually. The next thing worth checking out in the server is the strategist channel. If you found a technique that you think could have some use in speedruns, this is the place to share it. And you can also ask for advice or just discuss technical aspects about the game. The Speedrun.com leaderboards also occasionally host speedrunning competitions, so if you're interested in participating or spectating in any future events, the Discord server will contain the most up-to-date information. There are real cash prizes in these competitions, and you don't lose anything by participating, so don't be afraid to try it out if you're interested. And finally, there's the questions channel. So if you need help with anything or don't understand something about the leaderboards, there's an active community of people who are going to be more than happy to help you out. Mods are something that a lot of people will have questions about, so I would like to briefly discuss the subject and give some personal recommendations for client mods to enable during your runs. Note that if you're playing on console, this part of the video will not be applicable for you, but keep in mind that as long as you follow all of the other submission rules, you can submit runs done on console. Firstly, I strongly recommend checking the list of approved mods before you submit any runs, as not all mods are permitted to be used in speedruns, so it's important to be aware of this in case your run gets rejected. If you're wondering why the community has a list of approved mods, it mostly comes down to the fact that speedrunners tend to prefer playing only within the limits of what the game would normally allow, and many commonly used mods straight up make the game easier, or at the very least allow players to do something that they otherwise would not be able to. We don't just outright ban every mod, because most runners still like to be able to use harmless mods, such as ones that reskin the UI, or that let them retry runs more easily. Basically things that could provide no advantage of any kind when it comes to getting a better result. Restricting which mods people can use sets a standard that players can learn to expect from every run, instead of just turning speedrunning into an arms race to use the most broken mods available. The list of approved mods is made in such a way that even if you choose not to use mods at all, you're not going to be at a real disadvantage compared to other runners that do use them, even when competing for world record times. Overall, I would say that the rules are pretty lax when it comes to client mods, and most of the ones that people commonly use should be fine to enable in your runs. Regardless, you should still take your time to read the list of approved mods, since all of this is covered in further detail there. Some of my personal favorites when it comes to client mods, which you can see me use in a lot of the videos in this channel, include Inventory Sorter, which lets you change the shape and distribution of your inventory slots to something that might feel more comfortable for you. Too Many Items Plus, which you obviously can't use during a speedrun, but is incredibly useful to practice for them, since it gives you many useful commands such as spawning things in or regenerating the world faster. The Digital Clock mod is extremely handy. It adds a widget that converts the day clock to hours, minutes, and seconds, and makes it much easier to tell precisely how fast your run is, since runs in the Speedrun.com leaderboards are timed via the in-game timer, or IGT, as opposed to real-time, or RTA. The main differences between these two formats are that RTA has a harder time compensating for lag and load times, whereas IGT will always be easily convertible to a precise in-game day and segment count. But any time that passes while the game is paused will not be counted towards the final time in IGT. As for server mods, these are generally always banned, since they modify the game world itself as opposed to just what the client has access to. Therefore, server mods are generally only allowed in a per category basis, and a server mod being allowed in every category is very uncommon. But the two that you will be most commonly seeing are API Gemcore, which simply lets you input the seed that you want, so that it will always generate that particular world. So you'll want this mod for seeded speedruns. Don't Starve Alone, which on a solo world completely eliminates the lag caused by having caves enabled. I've seen a few misconceptions floating around regarding the topic of lag in DST, so I thought it would be a good time to briefly discuss the subject now that it's relevant. For those unaware, DST is generally very easy to run as long as you don't enable caves, because when you do, the game essentially creates another instance of the world that it runs in parallel to your surface world, and in worlds with caves enabled, the host of the game is essentially treated as just another client to their own server, which adds a noticeable amount of extra input lag as long as caves are enabled. In addition to just being really annoying in general and being responsible for giving DST its distinct lagginess compared to regular Don't Starve, caves lag also makes it virtually impossible to execute certain speedrun techniques, which is why even though you could argue that Don't Starve Alone makes the game easier, the speedrun community overall agreed that the poor optimization of the game was not our fault and it was best to allow people to use this mod for lack of a better alternative. Additionally, enabling this mod can reduce loading times, as pointed out by Lardy137 in this excellent video he made talking about the mod. It's also worth mentioning that for those playing on older CPUs that can barely run a surface-only world at 60 frames per second, turning caves on can make the game nearly unplayable, which this mod solves, so it has the added benefit of lowering the entry barrier so more people can participate in the speedrun leaderboards without feeling like they are at a disadvantage because of their hardware. That said, I would like to make it clear that DST is a very poorly optimized game, and contrary to what some people believe, having a high-end PC will not eliminate caves lag, as it is an issue with the game itself. Installing DST on a fast hard drive like an SSD also doesn't seem to make a difference at all when it comes to loading times, so this might be another case of poor optimization. At the end of the day, whether you want to use the Don't Starve Alone mod or not is entirely up to you, and you don't need to use it to get records. So if you prefer the vanilla experience, you don't have to use it, although most runners currently choose to. As for game settings, they are pretty straightforward. Sound effect volume should ideally be the highest, as they include all sound effects made by mobs and the player. I would also heavily recommend turning ambient volume down to 0, since this will completely eliminate the noises caused by insanity and other sources such as earthquakes. HUD and crafting menu size are a personal preference, although a smaller HUD can technically give you a little bit more visibility. Backpack layout is personal preference. I prefer the separated one more, but the integrated one will put all your items in one place, so I would recommend you just try it out and see what you like more. It's best to leave auto pause disabled if you plan to submit a speedrun, because there are rules against excessive pausing, although this shouldn't be a problem in most cases. More crafting pin pages are always useful, since you can customize each page for a different category, and you can quickly cycle between them when you need them. As for controls, these are all personal preference, although I do have a few recommendations if you want to speedrun the game more efficiently. If you have a mouse with side buttons, I absolutely recommend using them now that the game supports mapping actions to them. Personally, I bound my first inventory slot to mouse 4 to make switching between hand slot items easier, and I made it so mouse 5 opens the crafting menu, which is very comfortable to me. I recommend binding the pinned recipe page left and right to two keys that you can quickly access, so you don't have to click to switch between them. In my case, I bound them to X and C. The default keybind for the map is M, and I would strongly recommend you bind it to tab instead, because that way you don't have to reach across the keyboard just to see your map. You can bind zoom out to a key other than the scroll wheel, which will let you get the maximum visibility radius at all times by simply holding it down, instead of having to repeatedly move your scroll wheel. Although, because of the cloud overlay, I personally find this to be more distracting than helpful. And lastly, a lot of players remap the key that is used to attack, which by default is on F, usually to a key like spacebar or left shift. This is because the default F requires you to get your index finger off the WASD keys, adding a little bit of a delay before you begin an attack, which can be avoided by using a different key. However, this is strictly personal preference, and you can do perfectly well regardless of what you choose. Personally, I use the F key, but if you're new to this whole thing, I would recommend trying out different keybinds and seeing what works best for you. Onto graphics settings, the optimal aspect ratio for the most visibility will be 16:9. You can have an even wider field of view if your monitor supports it, but the Speedrun.com rules don't allow this, for the sake of keeping things fair for everyone. A refresh rate higher than 60 won't actually affect the game at all. You can see in the FPS counter that it will cap at 60 no matter what. The smoothness of your mouse cursor will still be affected if you have a monitor that supports FPS higher than 60, but that's about it. Disabling distortion and screen shake should be a no-brainer for fairly obvious reasons. There's a few options here that are intended to help people with older hardware, although I should mention that if you're playing on a PC with a processor from the last 5 years or so, you should be able to both play and record the SD with case enabled with no additional input lag other than the case lag itself, and you will not need to turn on these settings. Keep in mind the SD is largely CPU dependent, so even if you're running on integrated graphics, you shouldn't have any major issues. That said, if you're running on older hardware and you cannot keep a stable frame rate, you should try messing around with these settings, just to see if that helps. And finally, for the advanced settings. Lag compensation only makes a difference if you're playing on someone else's world, or if you're playing on a world with caves and are not using Don't Starve alone. What this option does is it hides what your character is actually doing, and instead it displays a simulated version of what your character would be doing if you had zero input lag. In a speedrun environment, this doesn't really help you or harm you in any significant way. Most people prefer to have it disabled, but you're not exactly handicapping yourself by enabling it. Enabling it does allow you to perform some useful techniques, such as the ones seen here, although these are very niche situations and I would recommend most people to keep it disabled. The last setting worth mentioning here is crafting preview, which I would recommend setting to all recipes, as it will allow you to pin and view the ingredients of every recipe, even if you're not standing right next to a science station. It also makes the menu feel less unpredictable, since nothing's going to pop in as soon as you approach any crafting structure. That just about covers every relevant setting for speedrunning. Anything that I didn't mention was either not impactful or not relevant to the scope of this video. This guide wouldn't be complete without briefly going over some of the most popular techniques you'll see in DST speedruns. I'll also be including some tips and tricks for people who are not super familiar with playing the game quickly in general. A lot of these might be fairly obvious to some of you watching, but I ask questions about these all the time, so I think it's best for everyone to be on the same page. The first thing we'll be talking about is using your mouse cursor to move around, instead of the WASD keys. This has two main benefits. The first of them is that it gives you 360 degrees of movement instead of being locked to just 8 directions. This lets you take the shortest possible path from point A to point B. Because of basic geometry, a straight line will always be shorter than trying to awkwardly stutter around in multiple directions to reach the same place. This may not seem like much, but this definitely adds up, not just in speedruns, but in any playthrough. If you're playing on a controller, you will have the full 360 degrees of movement by default. The second benefit of moving with your mouse is that you can walk while keeping the map open. By keeping the map open while walking in darkness, you basically have night vision as long as what you're looking for is visible on the map. You'll pretty much always see players do this in runs where the ruins have to be visited early, without access to items such as lanterns or moggles. The next thing you'll see people do a lot in speedruns is take full advantage of their field of view. On your screen, the 2 points that will give you the most visibility by far will be your top right and top left corners. By rotating your screen, which by default will be with your Q and E keys, you'll be able to get maximum coverage by getting as much of the map as possible into these areas of your screen, making it more likely that you'll spot something that you're looking for. Combined with zooming out to see even further, it's possible to need to walk quite a bit less to find what you need in a run. Up next is minimizing the impact of loading screens. While I did mention that excessive pausing is discouraged in a run, the exception to this is pausing right before a loading screen. For example, you can press the pause hotkey right after entering a sinkhole to completely avoid the loss of in-game time that would be caused by the loading screen. Since runs are timed using the in-game clock, if all runners do this, then that essentially eliminates the annoying variable that is loading screens, which evens the playing field across devices and makes runs much more consistent, because even within the same device, the duration of loading screens can be unpredictable at times. It's also annoying in general not to have control over your character while time is still running. This essentially makes room for runners to try out strategies that otherwise would not be viable. Additionally, in co-op runs, this makes it possible to simply pause while the other players are loading in, and then unpause when everyone's ready, which bypasses an otherwise tedious side effect of everyone taking a different amount of time to load into a world. Arguably the most well-known trick associated with DST speedrunning, animation cancelling. There's a good chance you may have seen this trick already and wasn't sure what exactly was going on, but it's actually pretty simple. Performing actions such as moving or unequipping items while in the middle of an attack animation will cancel it, so you do not have to fully commit to it. Cancelling this animation right as the hit connects with an enemy will allow you to begin another attack shortly after, which results in an overall shorter attack animation than if you didn't cancel it. This means you can attack slightly faster. To be precise, the maximum attack speed you can reach by doing this is 2.5 attacks per second. Attacking any faster than that is not possible because the developers did add a hard cap to how fast you can attack. The most common method to execute this technique is to switch between two pieces of head or body armor, or switch between two weapons. However, there are other methods, such as lightly tapping a movement key with lag compensation enabled, unequipping a single armor piece, or even unequipping and re-equipping a weapon immediately afterwards. Learning to execute this technique consistently will require a bit of practice, but once you get used to it, it's actually pretty fun and opens up the game's combat by allowing you to take greater risks in exchange for greater rewards, and take a more active role instead of just holding down the F key. If done right, animation cancelling usually guarantees an extra hit against the majority of mobs and bosses in the game in between kiting cycles. Whether you want to learn this technique or not is ultimately up to you though, and as a beginner, you should not worry too much about learning it right away. Speaking of cancelling animations, you can actually cancel quite a bit more than just the attack animation. Clicking repeatedly to chop and mine faster are the ones everyone knows about, but you would be surprised at just how many animations can be sped up by pressing the right keys at the right time. I will be putting some examples up on screen right now. There's a good chance that you've already seen some of these in action. Sure, they don't exactly save a ton of time, but they are fun to do, and once you get into the habit of doing them without really having to think about it, the time you save will definitely add up in the long run. I would like to add a little bit of advice for people trying to improve at speedrunning. If you're not confident in being able to execute a particular strategy perfectly, it is almost always recommended to go for consistency over speed. If you have a strategy that could benefit from a particular set piece to generate in your world, you might be tempted to just reset until you get that specific generation. This will only result in you getting frustrated due to the few opportunities that you will have to even attempt a run. you'll almost always be better off starting off with a strategy that is not as reliant on luck. Try to build upon that and go for more RNG based strategies once you have more practice. This doesn't just apply to luck based strategies, but also to those that are simply too difficult to execute 100% of the time. For example, if you're speedrunning Dragonfly for the first time, it would be advisable to craft an extra set of stone walls for the fight. This is only a time loss of a few seconds, in exchange for a much more consistent fight. The final piece of advice before we wrap up this video, and which may seem pretty obvious, but I see a lot of runners make this mistake. You should practice your runs in a test world before you start grinding attempts, especially for boss kills. I see a lot of new runners immediately begin to reset worlds until they reach the boss for the first time, only to fail right away and get frustrated because they aren't getting any successful runs. It's very easy to be overconfident and not account for the pressure of executing a boss fight to near perfection, so what you should do is create a world and use console commands or mods to spawn in what you need and practice as much as you need to with the rollbacks. Do this until you feel that you can reproduce the fight fairly consistently and then start grinding for runs. Additionally, it helps a lot to have a list of the exact amount of resources that you'll need for a run. Writing your strategy down helps a lot to relieve the pressure that comes with having to gather many different resources, and it makes it less likely that you'll pick up far more resources than necessary, or that you'll forget to pick up some necessary resource and have to backtrack, both of which would waste a lot of time. Furthermore, don't reset runs too often. Not every run that you complete is going to be a world record. It's important to complete runs even if they're not new records, as this will make sure that you're getting practice in all aspects of the run. By setting unrealistic expectations for your runs, you will only be making yourself lose motivation much faster. So just remember to enjoy it and take pride in your personal accomplishments. And that just about covers everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I could go way more in depth and talk about the specific strategies that are used for every category, but the purpose of this video was simply to give a general overview of how DST speedrunning works and how you can participate in it if you're interested. I really hope you found this informative, and I want to give a huge shout out to everyone from the DST speedrunning Discord who helped me with this video. You should totally join the community through the link below if you're interested in learning more about the game or just want to hang out. The Discord is the only place where you'll be able to find up-to-date information about each category, and if you need help with anything, you'll absolutely be able to find someone willing to help you out. Don't forget, we also host speedrun competitions every now and then, and there's a really big one on the way, so I would totally recommend joining to check that out. If you have any questions about the video, let me know in the comments, or if you found it helpful, I'd also appreciate if you let me know. Thanks a lot for watching this video, and good luck with your runs. I'll see you soon.